They said his son would never hear. Not the top neurologists, not the million-dollar treatments, not the prayers whispered in hospital waiting rooms. For 8 years, Evan flinched whenever anyone touched behind his ear. Every specialist said the same thing. His hearing nerves never formed. There's nothing we can do. His father spent fortunes, traveled continents, begged the world's top neurologist to look one more time. Then, a private teacher noticed something every expert had missed, and what she pulled from that child's ear made even a billionaire fall to his knees. Grant Wallace was untouchable. Tech empire, private security, wealth that could buy entire hospitals. But his son Evan was born completely deaf. 8 years old, never spoke a word, never heard his father say, "I love you." Grant tried everything. Boston Children's Hospital, London, Germany. Audiologists who charged more per consultation than most people earn in a year. They ran brain scans, cochlear evaluations, genetic tests. All of them said the same thing: permanent, move on. But Grant couldn't move on because Evan was the only thing left of his wife. She died the moment that boy took his first breath. So Grant kept searching, kept praying, kept asking God why he would take everything and leave him with silence. What he didn't realize, the answer wasn't hiding in a research lab. It was walking through his mansion door disguised as a teacher. Naomi Brooks was a private tutor, soft-spoken, no fame, no medical background, just a woman with a gift her grandmother passed down, a sensitivity to see what others overlook. But she noticed something about Evan that dozens of specialists had dismissed, something blocking what should never be blocked. Something lodged so deep, it looked like it had been sealed there on purpose. And one quiet afternoon, while Grant stood frozen in the doorway, she made a move that would either break a curse or shatter a family forever. What happened in that room? You need to witness it yourself. Before we go further, hit subscribe, drop a like on this video, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from right now. I believe God led this story to your screen today because there's something in it you need to hear. What happened in that room? You need to witness it yourself. Before we go further, hit subscribe, drop a like on this video, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from right now. I believe God led this story to your screen today because there's something in it you need to hear. But to understand the magnitude of that moment, you need to go back. Back to the night Evan was born. Back to the prayer Grant whispered over his dying wife. Back to the 8 years of silence that followed, and the guilt that slowly consumed a man who thought money could solve anything. This is the story of a father who lost faith, a son who lived in darkness, and a teacher who carried a gift the world told her didn't exist. Let me take you back to where it all began. Naomi Brooks wasn't supposed to be there. She wasn't on Grant Wallace's radar. No Ivy League credentials. No published research. No TED Talk about childhood development. Just a woman with a resume that listed 3 years at a private tutoring center and a reference letter from a church in South Carolina that Grant's assistant almost threw away. But something about her application stood out. Maybe it was the handwritten note at the bottom. I don't believe any child is unreachable. I believe some just need someone willing to listen beyond words. Grant hired her because he was desperate. And desperation makes you try things you wouldn't normally consider. What Grant didn't know was that Naomi came from a lineage of women who saw what others couldn't. Her grandmother, Mother Elise, had been known in their small town as the praying woman, the one people called when doctors gave up, the one who would sit beside a hospital bed and whisper prayers until something shifted. Naomi watched her grandmother pray over a blind girl named Shanice when she was just 14 years old. Watched the girl's eyes flutter open 3 days later, seeing shadows and light where there had been nothing but darkness. The doctors called it a spontaneous recovery. Her grandmother called it obedience. Naomi never advertised what she carried. She didn't perform miracles on demand or claim to have healing hands. She simply listened. To children, to intuition, to that quiet voice that spoke when everyone else was shouting. And when she first met Evan, sitting at a table in the sunlit classroom of the Wallace estate, that voice whispered, "This one has been waiting for you." Naomi started slow. Sign language, visual aids, gentle routines. But while she taught, she watched. She noticed things the specialists had dismissed as irrelevant. The way Evan's hand always drifted to the right side of his head when he was frustrated. The way he tensed whenever she moved near that ear. The way his eyes tracked vibrations, low hums, rhythms, as if his body was reaching for something his mind couldn't access. She kept a leather notebook. In it, she wrote observations no medical report had ever recorded. Day 4. He reacts to pressure behind right ear. Not pain. Something else. Awareness. Day 9. His eyes follow vibrations. He feels sound even though he can't hear it. Day 12. There is something he feels but cannot explain. Something trapped. Grant reviewed her reports once a week. He scanned them with the detachment of a CEO reading quarterly earnings. Results. That's all he cared about. Is my son improving? Can he communicate better? Will he ever be normal? One evening, he called her into his office. The room smelled like leather and expensive whiskey. He didn't offer her a seat. Miss Brooks, I appreciate your dedication. But I need to be clear about something. My son has been examined by the best minds in the world. If there was something physically wrong that could be fixed, they would have found it. So please, don't give him false hope. I've seen enough disappointment. Naomi met his eyes, calm and steady. Mr. Wallace, I'm not here to give false hope. I'm here to pay attention. Grant didn't respond. He just nodded toward the door. But Naomi kept watching, kept writing, kept praying. Late one night, long after Evan had been put to bed and the estate had gone quiet, Naomi sat alone in the classroom. The lights were dim. The air was still. She opened her notebook, flipped through the pages, and felt that familiar pull, the same pull her grandmother used to describe. The knowing that comes without explanation. She bowed her head. God, I don't understand what I'm seeing, but I know you didn't bring me here by accident. If there's something blocking this child, something everyone else has missed, please show me. Let me see what you see. The room stayed silent, but something settled in her spirit. A clarity, a direction. The next day, she asked Evan to sit still while she examined his right ear more closely. She didn't use instruments, just her eyes, her intuition. And as she leaned in, studying the small canal that every specialist had scanned and dismissed, she felt it again. This isn't just physical. There's something here that shouldn't be. She didn't say anything to Grant. Not yet. She needed to be sure. But 3 days later, Grant walked into the classroom unannounced. He'd been doing that more often lately. Checking in without warning. Watching from the doorway like a man afraid to hope but unable to look away. What he saw stopped him cold. Naomi had Evan sitting in a chair, his head tilted slightly, and she was leaning close to his ear, her lips moving in what looked like a whisper. But Grant knew that posture. He'd seen it before. In churches, in hospital chapels. She wasn't teaching. She was praying. His voice came out sharper than he intended. What are you doing? Naomi straightened, her expression calm but firm. I'm asking for help. Grant's jaw tightened. I didn't hire you to pray over my son. I hired you to teach him. And I am teaching him, Mr. Wallace. But some things require more than lesson plans. Grant took a step forward, his frustration rising. My son doesn't need faith. He needs science. He needs solutions. Not some spiritual experiment that's going to, if money could fix him, Naomi interrupted softly, he would be healed by now. The room went silent. Grant stared at her, anger flashing in his eyes, but beneath it, something else. Fear. Exhaustion. The weight of 8 years crashing down all at once. He opened his mouth to respond, to fire her, to end this before it went any further. But then, Evan winced. It was small, barely noticeable. But Naomi saw it. Grant saw it. Evan's hand shot up to the right side of his head, his face twisting in discomfort as Naomi's fingers gently touched a precise spot behind his ear. A spot no doctor had ever tested. Naomi's breath caught. Her eyes locked on Evan's face, then shifted to Grant, and in that moment, everything changed. Because whatever was inside that boy's ear, it had just made itself known. Naomi didn't move. She stayed perfectly still, her fingers hovering near the spot that had made Evan flinch. Grant stood frozen in the doorway, his earlier anger dissolving into something closer to dread. "What did you just do?" His voice was barely above a whisper. Naomi didn't answer. She was staring at Evan's ear with an intensity that made Grant's chest tighten. Slowly, carefully, she tilted Evan's head toward the light streaming through the classroom window. "Mr. Wallace," she said quietly, "when was the last time someone actually looked inside his ear? Not scanned it, not tested the nerves, just looked." Grant blinked. "I don't know. Years, maybe. They said there was no point. The issue was neurological. Not." She raised a hand, cutting him off. "Come here." Grant hesitated. Then he crossed the room, his expensive shoes silent on the polished floor. He leaned over Naomi's shoulder, close enough to see what she was seeing, and what he saw made his blood run cold. Deep inside Evan's ear canal, far beyond where wax normally collected, there was something dark. Something solid. It wasn't moving. It wasn't inflamed. It was just there. Lodged. Sealed. Like it had been placed there intentionally and forgotten. "That's not," Grant's voice trailed off. "That's not supposed to be there." "No," Naomi whispered. "It's not." She pulled back slowly, her mind racing. She'd seen buildups before, blockages, things that looked strange under examination. But this was different. This wasn't natural accumulation. It looked deliberate, like a covering. A seal over something that was meant to be open. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory, words spoken over her years ago during a prayer service. "Child, when God is ready to open what has been closed, He will send someone to break the seal, and you won't need a scalpel. You'll just need obedience." Naomi's hands trembled slightly. She steadied them. "Mr. Wallace," she said, her tone calm but firm, "I think I can remove this." Grant's head snapped toward her. "What? No. Absolutely not. You're not a doctor. You can't just—" "If I don't," she interrupted, "no one will. Because no one else is looking." The room went silent. Evan sat perfectly still between them, unaware of the storm brewing above his head. Grant's jaw clenched. Every instinct in him screamed to stop this. To call a medical professional. To do things the right way. But something deeper, something he hadn't felt in 8 years, whispered, "Let her try." He stepped back. His voice came out rough. "If you hurt him, I won't," Naomi said simply. She turned back to Evan, her expression soft, reassuring. She placed one hand gently on his shoulder, grounding him, letting him know he was safe. Then, with her other hand, she reached for a pair of sterilized tweezers she kept in her teaching kit. Not medical grade, just standard classroom tools. But in that moment, they felt like instruments of divine appointment. She whispered a prayer under her breath, too quiet for Grant to hear. Just between her and the God she'd learned to trust when nothing else made sense. Then she leaned in. The extraction took less than 10 seconds. Naomi's hands were steady, her movements precise. The mass came out in one piece, smooth and waxy. Larger than anything that should have been able to lodge itself that deep, without causing infection or pain. It looked almost sculpted, unnatural. Grant stared at it, his face pale. "What is that?" Naomi didn't answer. Because in that moment, something else happened. Evan gasped. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic. But it was real. His eyes went wide, his body going rigid as if the entire world had just tilted off its axis. His head whipped toward the window, toward the faint rustle of trees outside. Then toward the chair Naomi had been sitting in, the one that scraped slightly against the floor as she shifted her weight. Evan's mouth opened, his lips trembled, and then, for the first time in his entire life, sound left his throat in the form of a word. Dad? It was barely audible, shaky, terrified, but unmistakable. Grant's knees buckled. He didn't try to catch himself. He just fell, hitting the floor hard, his hands covering his face as 8 years of grief, guilt, and unanswered prayers came pouring out in broken sobs. He'd built empires. He'd commanded boardrooms. He'd stared down competitors and politicians and journalists. But in that moment, he was just a father who had lost everything and been given back something he thought was gone forever. Evan turned toward the sound of his father's crying, his small face twisted in confusion and fear. He didn't understand what was happening, didn't understand why everything suddenly felt so loud, so overwhelming, so impossibly big. His own tears came next, not sad tears, not happy tears, just the tears of a child whose world had just exploded into noise and chaos and sensation he had no framework to process. He reached for his father, his small hands trembling. Grant grabbed him, pulling him close, holding him so tight it was like he was afraid Evan might disappear if he let go. He whispered into his son's hair, over and over, words he'd said 1,000 times but never been heard. I love you. I love you. I'm so sorry. I love you. And Evan, trembling and crying and clutching his father's shirt, heard every single word. Naomi stood back, her hands still holding the waxy mass she'd pulled from Evan's ear. She stared at it for a long moment, then set it down on the table. Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't let them fall. Not yet. She just bowed her head and whispered 2 words. Thank you. Because she knew this wasn't her miracle. It never had been. She was just the vessel, the answer to a prayer a desperate father had stopped praying, the instrument God used when science gave up. And as Grant held his son and wept, and as Evan heard his father's voice for the very first time, the silence that had ruled that house for 8 years finally, mercifully, shattered. The emergency room at Boston Children's Hospital hadn't seen Grant Wallace in 2 years. But 48 hours after Evan spoke his first word, Grant was back. This time carrying hope instead of desperation. The doctors ran every test they'd run before. Audiometry, tympanometry, auditory brainstem response. They examined the mass Naomi had extracted, now sealed in a sterile container. They measured Evan's responses to sound, watched him flinch at the beep of machines, watched him turn toward voices. And then they sat Grant down in a consultation room and admitted something most doctors never say. We don't understand how this is possible. Dr. Philip Crane, the same neurologist who declared Evan's case irreversible 3 years prior, held up the scans. His voice was careful, clinical, but beneath it was something close to disbelief. Mr. Wallace, this obstruction was lodged in a position that should have caused severe infection. It should have been detected in at least 4 of the imaging procedures we performed, and yet, somehow, it wasn't. Grant leaned forward. So you're saying it was there the whole time? Dr. Crane hesitated. I'm saying it appears to have been there. But I can't explain how we missed it, or how a non-medical professional was able to extract it without causing damage. Another doctor, younger, less restrained, spoke up from the corner of the room, or how it got there in the first place. That's not a natural formation, Mr. Wallace. That's not earwax. That's something else entirely. Then what is it? Grant asked. The room went quiet. No one had an answer. Some of them called it impossible. Others, more quietly, suggested Naomi had staged the whole thing, planted evidence, manipulated a desperate father for attention or money. But none of them could deny the evidence sitting in front of them. Evan Wallace could hear. Grant left the hospital that afternoon with a medical report that raised more questions than it answered. But he didn't care about the questions anymore. He cared about the boy sitting beside him in the car, staring out the window, mesmerized by the hum of the engine and the whoosh of passing traffic. That evening, Grant found Naomi in the library, packing her things. She'd assumed her job was done, that once the miracle happened, she'd no longer be needed. Grant stood in the doorway, watching her for a long moment before he spoke. "I owe you an apology." Naomi turned, surprised. "Mr. Wallace, you don't." "Yes, I do." He stepped into the room, his voice thick with emotion. "I doubted you. I dismissed you. I thought you were wasting time with prayers and spiritual talk when my son needed real help. And I was wrong. About all of it." Naomi set down the book she'd been holding. "You weren't wrong to want answers, Mr. Wallace. You were just looking in the wrong places." Grant's throat tightened. "For 8 years, I blamed God for taking my wife. For leaving me with a son I couldn't fix. I thought he'd abandoned us. But the truth is, I stopped listening. I stopped believing he could still move. And then you showed up." He paused, his eyes red. "And I almost fired you." Naomi smiled softly. "But you didn't." "No," Grant whispered. "I didn't. And I'll spend the rest of my life grateful for that." Upstairs, Evan was discovering the world in a way he'd never imagined. The sound of rain tapping against his bedroom window, the creak of floorboards as someone walked down the hall, the rustle of his own sheets as he moved. But the sound that changed everything came 3 nights later. Grant was sitting on the edge of Evan's bed, tucking him in the way he'd done every night for 8 years, and for the first time, he said the words aloud, knowing they'd be heard. "I love you, Evan." Evan's eyes locked on his father's face. His lips moved, trying to form the shapes, the sounds, the meaning. "I." His voice cracked. His face scrunched with effort. "Love you." It wasn't perfect. It was shaky, broken, barely intelligible, but it was real, and it was his. Grant pulled his son into his arms and wept. 2 weeks later, Grant called Naomi into his office. This time, he offered her a seat. "I want to do something," he said. "Something that matters. I want to build a center for kids like Evan. Kids the system has given up on. Kids who need someone to see what others won't. And I want you to run it." Naomi stared at him, stunned. "Mr. Wallace, I'll fund everything. Staff, facilities, research. You'll have whatever you need. You can help hundreds of children, maybe thousands." Naomi was quiet for a long moment. Then she shook her head gently. "I'm honored. Truly. But I can't take credit for what happened here. I was only a vessel. The miracle was never mine." Grant's expression softened. "Then, whose was it?" Naomi smiled. "You know whose it was." And for the first time in years, Grant did. He started praying again. Not the desperate, bargaining prayers of a man trying to control outcomes, but the humble, surrendered prayers of a man who'd finally learned to listen. Evan slept peacefully now. No more nightmares. No more waking up frustrated, trapped in a silent world. He dreamed in sound. And when he woke, he heard his father's voice calling him downstairs for breakfast. Naomi left the Wallace estate on a quiet Sunday morning. No grand farewell. No ceremony. Just a hug from Evan and a handshake from Grant that lasted longer than either of them expected. As her car pulled down the long driveway, she glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. Tears filled her eyes, but they weren't sad. They were grateful, because she'd seen it happen again. The same God who used her grandmother to heal the sick. The same God who makes a way when there is no way. The same God who still uses the humble to confound the wise. Grant stood at the window, watching her leave. Then he turned and looked out at the backyard, where Evan was running through the grass, laughing, spinning, listening to the wind and the birds and the sound of his own joy. Grant's voice was barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of 8 years breaking open. "You were never silent. I just needed faith to hear you." And somewhere beyond the noise and the chaos and the miracles men try to explain, God smiled. Because he'd been speaking all along,